Okay, welcome everybody to another vocabulary class. Please, if you're watching this on YouTube and you want to buy the whole course, just click the link under the video, which should give you a cheaper discount. So regulations and authority today. Now we did crime, so some of these words will be repetitions, of course, and we like repetition on this course because it helps you, of course, learn the new vocabulary. So regulations and authority, a lot of this is crime vocabulary or legal vocabulary, because who makes the regulations? Well, the authorities make the regulations. And so usually this is a legal area. Now, I want to immediately say that we often say the powers that be to refer to the powers, the people that are in power. They are the powers that be. You can say the authorities, and that usually means the government or the police or the local council, the people in charge. Yeah, they are the powers that be. They are the authorities. And yeah, this is weird. I looked at it and thought the be was subjunctive, but I read in Wikipedia that it's not. It looks like subjunctive to me, but okay, I'll take that. I'll take that information as I'll go along with that. There's a good phrasal verb that we did yesterday. I'll go along with that because I'm not actually sure, but it looks a lot like subjunctive. The powers that be. And yeah, the powers that be, it's really anybody in a position of authority. They are the powers that be. They're in charge. And so you can pass new regulations, you can pass new legislation, you can pass new laws. In fact, you can't pass regulations, sorry. You can bring in regulations, but you can't pass regulations, sorry. So pass new legislation, pass new laws, or bring in new legislation, bring in new laws, bring in new regulations. Bring in works with all of them. You can also phase in new legislation, new laws, which means bring in those laws in stages. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So usually it's slower, and laws or regulations or legislation gets brought in, it gets phased in stages. Okay, so I think that's all clear. Now, this is a really important word, policy. If you never use it, I don't know how you're going to say some things. It's just it's got such a wide definition. A policy is just a set of guidelines. That's all it is. It's a set of guidelines that lay out, that establish how you will act in the next few years or in the next few decades. That's what a policy is. So it's a plan, and governments are supposed to plan for the future, and so governments, they have policies, they have guidelines which they attempt to implement. They must implement these policies. They adopt different policies. Different politicians adopt different policies. You can amend a policy, which means change it in some way. You can reverse a policy, which means you climb down. You completely change. You do a U-turn. There's a good one. You do a U-turn with your policies, and maybe your policy was to increase taxes, but then you do a U-turn and you decrease taxes. Yeah, so that's reverse a policy. And you might need to determine policies, which means just, work out what policies you are going to follow. And so you can certainly follow policy as well. But notice all of these different verbs that work with policy. There are lots of verbs that work with policy. And there are lots of adjectives. You can talk about economic policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy, educational policy, environmental policy. Now, of course, this is whatever guidelines you're implementing in the schools, yeah? Maybe you are, I think for many, many years, since I was a very, very, very little baby, the educational policy and the environmental policy, well, there's been an awful lot of environmental policy within the education system. Within the education system, there's been an awful lot of environmental policy. So I was told when I was far too young to understand what the end of the world even meant, but that the end of the world was coming and it would be an environmental catastrophe. I was taught this at school when I was far too young to learn about such things. But I was told that there would be an environmental catastrophe, and that we'll either burn to death or starve to death or freeze to death in the future, mainly because of that awful thing called oil that's in our ground that we all use every single day. And so it's been policy, government policy for a long, long time in this country to try to teach children that they are destroying themselves, they're destroying the planet, that they are disgusting creatures, and that it would be better off if they hadn't been born. That's our government's policy to how to teach children about the world around them. And I have children now, and I can see that nothing has changed. None of these policies have been amended. We still have exactly the same policies in our schools. And the policy is simple. It's teach the children that human beings are the worst animal on the planet. Teach the children that human beings are responsible for destroying the planet. And teach the children that human beings, the fewer human beings there are on planet Earth, the better. And so that's our current educational policy and environmental policy. I think it's disgusting. And not only that, I think it's wrong. Okay? I think it's misinformation that we're spreading in the schools. Now, foreign policy would be your policies to other countries. And so when we're dealing with foreign policy, I think our Minister for Foreign Policy recently went to Russia and was unable, well, she didn't understand which towns were even in the country. And so she said, we'll never agree that Rostov is part of Russia. Rostov is certainly part of Russia. It always has been. Anyway, that's our Minister for Foreign Affairs, good old Miss Truss. She might even be Prime Minister soon, this woman who goes around the world and tells people that cities that belong to their country aren't even in their country. I mean, she's an embarrassment, but she is in charge of foreign policy and possibly in charge of the whole country very soon. Domestic policy is your policy for your own country. Yeah, think of domestic flights, international flights. Domestic flights are flights that happen within your own country, and international is abroad. Well, here, the difference between foreign and domestic is the same. Foreign policy is your policy for other countries. Domestic policy, these are your policies that you implement for your own country. And of course, government policy just means whatever the government, the current government guidelines are. And so I'm well aware what kind of educational policies the government have at the moment, because I have children and I still remember being there. And I think that there are a lot of similarities actually from when I went to school. And many of these, you know, the environmental brainwashing, for example, it was there when I was at school. And for me, it is a cult thinking. It's the same as a religious cult. Exactly the same. They try to tell you that it's the end of the world. It's the first thing that any cult does. Okay, anyway, you draw up guidelines, establish guidelines, lay out guidelines, propose guidelines, develop guidelines, set out guidelines. You usually say that